Bonjour, mes amis. Ici Jeff Diamond, Cutter Historical. Ici le vidéo de 10 plus moments de l'Expos de Montréal. L'Expos de Montréal, une équipe de la Ligue baseball majeure de 1969 à 2004. 36, excusez-moi, 35 saisons de la Ligue. Pas de série mondiale, pas de l'apparence de série mondiale, mais une chance d'aller de baseball au Canada. Of course, you know, my French is kind of weak and all that, but I tried my best. Anyway, so we're going to be looking at the top 10 Montreal Expo moments from their time from 1969 to 2004. I picked up this bad boy online. Yes, it's not an actual Expos jersey and it may be a sweater, and yes, it cost about $45 online. But you know what? Screw it. You know what? It's close enough, and I don't have an Expo shirt. I have Blue Jays shirts up the Yin Yang, but I don't have an Expo shirt, so got to do it for the product. Anyway, let's talk about the top 10 Montreal Expo moments of all time. I know it's not going to be easy, but I'll try my best, and I will be trying by being bilingual, but to a point. Okay, número 10. Number 10. L'arrivée de Vladdy Guerrero à 1996. Vladdy's arrival in 1996. So the Expos got lucky with a find in the Dominican Republic by the name of Vladimir Guerrero. And Vladdy was playing his heart out. His first home run in the majors against Atlanta, was such a way that P. Van Buren and Don Sutton were shocked about that pitch because the pitch was outside the zone. Guerrero would be known for swinging at bad balls and actually getting hits off of them. Flaherty had a cannon for an arm in 2001 against the Blue Jays in Toronto. He basically threw out Alberto Castillo, who was trying to go from second to home on a base hit, but Guerrero's cannon arm knocked him out of the plate. I think that Saturday game was when the Jays won in 11 innings, and Jose Fidel hit a 3-run home run off Billy Koch. Anyway, Flaherty looked pretty impressive and all that. He was the last great Expo. And, well, of course, the Expos had their contraction problems and all that. But then in 2004, he signed with the Angels, won AL MVP that same year, and Expo fans were pissed, I bet. Number 9. Un double de Gary Carter à 1992. Gary Carter's hit 1992. Now, Gary Carter was a legendary catcher for the Expos, and yes, he'll be featured in the top 10 Montreal Expos players of all time, but this is the top 10 moments. Gary Carter was a pretty good player, the catcher, the kid. He actually was going to be a quarterback at UCLA, but the Expos signed him. They let him go. They made him play the outfield, which he couldn't do, and then they made him catcher. And he was one of the best catchers in the National League in the 1980s. I mean, you could also argue for Bob Boone or Ted Simmons, but Gary Carter was the best. So anyway, Gary Carter was with Montreal until 1984 when they traded him after the 84 season to the Mets for Floyd Yeomans and Huey Brooks. Brooks was good. Yeomans was a bust in Montreal. And then Carter hit a home run in his first game as the Mets, a walk-off against the Cardinals on April 9th, 1985, Brian Elliott's birthday. And of course, this guy's. But anyway, so Gary Carter managed to come back to Montreal. He had pit stops in San Fran and Los Angeles, but the Expos picked him up as a backup catcher in 92, and he played his heart out. The second last week of the season, they were hosting the Chicago Cubs in their final home game. Carter was up at the plate. He would be the catcher. And in the 7th inning, he had a double off of Mike Morgan that bounced over the head of Andre the Hawk Dawson, another Expo icon. And Carter's double was amazing. It was his last hit in the major leagues, and that was perfect. Number 8. Le Jeu de Canada of 1960. No, sorry. 1997. Canada Day, 1997. So in 1997, MLB got the bright idea to have interleague play, as in an American League team would play a National League team a certain amount of times. In 97, the first iteration was that every team in the AL East would take on their NL East opponents, and then that was for the Central and the West as well. So Vladdy Guerrero was an icon. Why am I thinking that? But yeah, 97 Canada Day. The 3-game series that would run, the middle game would be on Canada Day was epic. That MLB would actually set that up in Toronto. Montreal beat Toronto 2-1 and beat Pat Hankin, the reigning Cy Young winner, with a few big hits. And then on Canada Day 97, Jeff Juden, number 14 in your programs, got to face his boyhood idol from Massachusetts, Roger Clemens. Clemens was doing well with the pitching, but unfortunately for him, he was outmatched by Jeff Juden, who took a no-hitter into the 8th inning when Sean Green hit a home run to right field. But that was Jeff Juden's only boo-boo, as he won 2-1. I have this game on my computer, and in English, and then the post-game interview in French, in which Claude Raymond and who was that guy? The French Canadian play-by-play guy. I can't remember. Doucette? No. Anyway, yeah. They talked to Jeff Juden about stuff, and that was amazing what he could do. The Jays won the 3rd game of that series, but in the end, it didn't happen. And of course, other than the Vladdy Guerrero 2001 game in which he threw Castillo out of the plate, there weren't really any memorable Expo Blue Jay moments other than that. Expo versus Blue Jays. Numéro 7. Bill Stoneman par de Simple, 1969. Bill Stoneman throwing a no-hitter in 1969. This was actually one of the most shocking moments of all time. This was only a week after the Expos were a franchise that Bill Stoneman would do this. This was the 8th game in Expos history, and the Expos were in Philadelphia to play the Phillies. Now, contrary to popular belief, they didn't play at Veterans Stadium. The Phillies did. That was not until 1971. 1969, they were at Connie Mack Stadium, which was the rename of Shy Park. So Bill Stoneman was a good pitcher and all that. He threw 2 no-hitters for the Expos, and his first was a shocker because he beat the Phillies, and this was the 8th game in Expos history. I still think it's the record for fastest no-hitter by a franchise, and it's the Expos who did it. Yeah, amazing. Numéro 6. Le premier jeu de Parc Jarry, 1969. The first game at Jerry Park, 1969. So the Expos were trying to find a place to play baseball at a stadium, much less be there. Montreal was threatened with their franchise being taken away of the Great Expansion without a proper stadium. So they had to find a park. They couldn't use the Autostad because that was where the Alouettes and the CFL were playing. So they went to Park Jerry, Jerry Park, which was a municipal stadium, a municipal park, and had a swimming pool past the right field fence. So the Expos made it work. They got a 28,000 seat stadium built in that tiny little cramped space and all that. It was cramped, like you don't believe. But their first game at home against the St. Louis Cardinals after a 3-game set in New York against the Mets, which I will talk about shortly, happened. And the Expos played 7 years. They were supposed to move to a new stadium by 1973, but it took the 1977 when they took Stade Olympique or Olympic Stadium away because Montreal built it for Olympics 1976, and that turned out to be terrible. It took them 3 decades to pay off the debt. 3 decades because they had that stupid inclined tower. Why would they have an inclined tower? Well, for the retractable roof, which was not placed on or tested till 1987. So they had to play open air games, and then years later they would build a roof, a permanent roof. Park Jerry is now it was called IGA Stadium. It's now Saputo Stadium, used for the tennis tournaments held in Montreal every year. Numéro 5. Le match des étoiles, 1982. the All-Star Game 1982. So it was actually a shock that Montreal got to host the All-Star Game in 1982 in the first place because, Canada wasn't really set for an All-Star Game. However, Montreal built themselves big. They had 5 Expos on that National League roster. They were the defending NL East champions and almost NL champs. But Rick Monday screwed them over. And no, obviously, I'm not putting that as the top moments of all time because it was so fucking negative. Anyhow, the Ace it was amazing in Montreal. And Montreal ended up hosting, and then ABC doing the job with Keith Jackson. No, sorry, Al Michaels. Can't remember. I say Earl Weaver and Howard Cosell. But yeah, Montreal. The pregame ceremony they had like the nations of baseball because it was in Canada. They had representatives from 11 different nations throughout first pitches, like not Roberto Clemente. What am I thinking? From Puerto Rico to Orlando Cepeda and a few Asian players, Asian legends. The National League won the game 4-1 thanks to Cesar Geronimo's home run off Dennis Eckersley when Eckersley was a starter and not a closer. And, Montreal did quite well for themselves. Everyone liked it. And 9 years later, Toronto got the All-Star game. Numéro 4. La victoire de la LDS de Montréal 1981. 1981 NLDS. So 1981 was a crazy year. Montreal, after 2 close calls in 1979 and 1980, actually ended up in the fight for the NL East. Unfortunately, there was a strike because people were upset with free agent compensation and everything. So that ruined the season for 50 days in the middle of the season. You don't see that every day going into the middle of the season. Although there was another baseball strike that did go kind of in the middle of the season, but it didn't work out. Regardless of that, Major League Baseball made a rule that whoever won the AL, NL, East, and West would all get a berth into what they call the League Division Series. That the two half champions, the first half and the second half champions, would meet each other and all that. If by some coincidence any of the 4 division winners from the first half won the second half, then it would be the second place team in each division in the second half. Well, regardless of that, there was no incentive and all that. Montreal finished, I think, 3rd in the NL East to start before the strike. And then after the strike, they shocked the Mets and shot up past St. Louis and Philly to win the NL East second half. So they would take on the Philadelphia Phillies, which actually screwed over St. Louis because St. Louis had the better record in the 2 halves. But Montreal and Philly were going to the playoffs. Cincinnati in the NL West could relate. They had the best record in baseball, much less winning that thing. Montreal would take on Philly, win 2 games in Philly, but then Philly would host the next 3 games. And it looked terrible. It looked like Montreal was going to choke down 2-0. Philly forced a game 5, but Steve Rogers outdueled Steve Carlton for the second time, 3-0. Expos were going to the NLCS. They had a chance against the Dodgers. All they needed to do was win game 4, and they choked, and then game 5 was rained out controversially because it didn't seem that bad. And then Rick Monday happened. Numéro 3. Premier jeu de l'Expo 1969, le 8e avril 1969. So the first game ever for the Expos was on April 8th, 1969 against the New York Mets. Tom Seaver would be on the bump for the Mets. I can't remember who the Expos sent. It wasn't Stoneman. I think it was Renko. But nevertheless, Montreal and the Mets played a classic first game of the season. Montreal ended up winning the game 11-10. Dan McGinn, who came into the game in the 3rd inning as a relief pitcher, actually hit a home run, which was shocking. And, the Expos beat the Mets. Of course, nobody expected the Mets, much less the 1969 Mets, to win the NL East and, of course, have that great season where they beat the Cubs thanks to the Black Cat. No, the Mets were never in the 10-team NL, never higher than 8th going to 1969. So it was a massive miracle and all that. It was like, how were we supposed to know that the Expos beating the Mets? They would have beaten the World Series, the eventual World Series champion. It was one heck of a game. Montreal fans were big. The Mets allowed the Montreal Brain Trust to throw out the first pitch, which was very nice and all that. It was a sweet thing and all that. Numero deux, number two, La saison de 1994, un bonheur, big waste. It's the 94 season. Yes, it ended with heartbreak, but Montreal had one of the best seasons in Major League history. They actually started out very slow in the first few months. By June, when they had swept the Atlanta Braves in a tough 3-game series at Olympic Stadium, they had momentum. They had won plenty of games. I think they had a 769 or something close winning percentage through July and August. Unfortunately, on May 12th, they did beat Pittsburgh, and then the waiting game happened. There was a strike because of a lot of things with a salary cap and everything else. 94 was a terrible year for sports in general. All 4 sports leagues had some labor problems. The NHL obviously didn't start the 94-95 season on time and had to wait till January. We don't know about baseball stuff. Football was close to striking, and the NBA had a referees shortage. Fortunately, though, they fixed it before the season started. So yeah, labor problems were the thing in 1994. The Expos just had a good season. They were projected to win 110 games in that 162 game season, which would be fantastic. It would be bigger than the 86 Mets. But unfortunately, the Expos couldn't play out the full season. They would have won the division. They had the best record in baseball. The Yankees were coming through finally and all that. The White Sox and Cleveland were fighting for supremacy in the AL Central. The NL Central looked like it was the Reds and the Dodgers in the NL West. The only good news about the 94 strike, which it denied us a 10 game under 500 Texas Rangers from making the playoffs because they were the tops in the West, even though the West was like a 3-game battle. But yeah, the 94 Expos just couldn't recover, and because of the season and the lost revenue from the playoffs from both American and Canadian broadcasters, the Expos had to sell off players. Larry Walker was not really given an offer, so he went to Colorado. They traded Ken Hill back to St. Louis. They traded John Wetland to the Yankees for Fernando Seguino and a bag of peanuts. They traded away Marcus Grissom to Atlanta for Roberto Kelly and some baseballs. Yeah, that was the beginning of the downfall for Montreal. And to this day, I say this to Bud Selig. Fuck you. No matter what he does, he says, and tries to deflect blame. Bud Selig could have easily avoided this baseball strike. And of course, the province of Quebec didn't want to fund a new stadium because of the whole hospital closing thing. That is legitimate. I understand that, but still, should not have happened. And number un, the perfecto de Dennis Martinez, 1991. For me, the 1991 perfect game of Dennis Martinez is definitely number 1 on everyone's list. How many guys throw a freaking perfect game and all that? The Blue Jays have only had 1 no-hitter in history. Montreal's had like 3 or 4. But this kind of looks like the jersey that, yes, this jersey kind of looks like the one that Dennis Martinez pitched in. And it was the blue ones. TSN had the game between the Expos and the Dodgers because they had the Expos exclusive coverage. CTV had some Expo games as well. CBC, I don't think, was doing baseball in 91. But anyway, yeah, Montreal, it was amazing. Dennis Martinez was a big story. Signed out of Nicaragua, he played for Baltimore, but he had an alcohol problem, which started with him using alcohol before the first ever game, thing, and all that. And then he went to Alcoholics Anonymous. He fixed his problem, but his pitching sucked. And a lot of people said that he was better with the alcohol in Baltimore. Baltimore traded him to Montreal, and Montreal put him in the bullpen, but he proved himself to be a starter. He had some hiccups, but who wouldn't? And he went great. 91, he was basically the ace of the Expos. They were facing the Dodgers in a 3-game series. That 3-game series was huge because on the Friday, the 26th of July, not July 28th, which was the perfecto, the Expos actually had a no-hit bid by Mark Gardner ruined in extra innings. The Expos couldn't score for shit. They had, a 30-inning streak of not scoring. And then on the Sunday, they couldn't score against Mike Morgan of the Dodgers till the seventh inning when they got 2 runs. Larry Walker, who was kind of playing out of position at first base, if you will, made a few key plays to keep Dennis Martinez in. So no Dodger batter reached base at all by any means necessary. Dennis Martinez got Chris Gwynn, Tony's brother, to pop up to right field. Grissom made the catch, and Dave Van Horn, the great Expos broadcaster, said, "El Presidente, El Perfecto." And it was perfecto. It really was. So anyway, merci beaucoup pour the écouter et regarder le video. I'm Jeff Diamond. Adieu.